At 7:32 p.m. on December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag still flew over the Kremlin. At 7:45 it was gone forever. No foreign army had taken Moscow and no shot had been fired. The country below that pole still covered 1/6 of the earth, still held 293 million people, still owned about 27,000 nuclear warheads. By midnight it had no name, no president, no legal address. How does a nuclear superpower erase itself on live television while the world watches? Moscow in 1988 smelled of queues in the snow. Sugar appeared on Tuesdays if you arrived at 5 a.m., meat on Fridays if you knew the shop manager. That was the superpower losing the argument in the kitchen, not on the battlefield. The man who tried to fix it took power on March 11, 1985, aged 54, the youngest Politburo member in decades. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He inherited an economy that looked stable and was already hollow. Oil paid for imported grain, oil paid for the army, oil paid for the empire. When oil collapsed in 1986, the hard currency collapsed with it. Then April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded. The fire burned for 10 days and poisoned Europe. 500,000 liquidators were drafted to bury the reactor in concrete. The bill was 18 billion rubles. A year's health and education budget turned to lead. Gorbachev answered with perestroika, restructuring that let factories set prices, and with glasnost, openness that let newspapers print the truth. He believed truth would disinfect the system. Truth showed the system was dead. The budget deficit was about 2% of GDP in the early 1980s, 11% by 1989, and 20% by 1991. 1 ruble in 5 was printed from nothing. Retail prices rose 140% in a single year. Official GDP fell 2% in 1990 and another 8% year-on-year in the first quarter of 1990-91. That was a peacetime collapse no Soviet citizen had ever seen. Viktor Gerashchenko, head of the central bank, told Gorbachev the Union stood on the brink of financial collapse. People stopped saving and shelves emptied faster. Lithuania declared independence on March 11, 1990. And Latvia and Estonia followed in May. Moscow cut fuel, sent troops, killed 14 at the Vilnius TV tower in January 1991, and still the parliament stayed. Inside Russia a rival rose. Yeltsin quit the Communist Party on live television in July 1990 and built his base in the Russian parliament, the White House. On June 12, 1991, he won Russia's first free presidential election with 57.3%, about 45.5 million votes. Gorbachev still sat in the Kremlin, but Yeltsin now owned the building across the river that could block Moscow. Gorbachev tried one last bargain to keep the country together, not with tanks but with paper. On March 17, 1991, he held the only union-wide vote in Soviet history. The ballot asked if the Union should be preserved as a renewed federation of equal republics where human rights are guaranteed. 6 republics refused to vote. The Baltics, Armenia, Georgia and Moldova stayed home. In the 9 that voted, the answer looked like a win. Turnout was 80% of 185 million eligible voters. About 148 million people voted and 113 million marked yes. That was 77.85% in favor. Gorbachev called it a mandate and took it to a dacha forest outside Moscow called Novo Ogoriovo. Through April, May, June and July of 1991, he met the leaders of 9 republics plus the center, 9 plus 1. They argued over taxes, armies and presidents. By late July, they had a draft that would turn the empire into a loose confederation. It kept a common president, a common army and a common foreign policy. Everything else would belong to the republics. The finished text had a cover page with a name, but think of it as a loose union of sovereign states. The ceremony was set for August 20, 1991. The Russian Republic would sign first, Kazakhstan the same day, the rest in September. On paper the union would survive as something new. In reality, 3 men who ran the old union read the final draft and saw a dismissal notice. The prime minister who signed money was Valentin Pavlov. The defense minister who signed orders was Dmitry Yazov. And the KGB chairman who signed surveillance lists was Vladimir Kryachkov. They controlled the printing presses, the paratroopers and the wiretaps. They also heard a secret recording. On July 29 at Novo Ogoriovo, Gorbachev met privately with Yeltsin and Kazakhstan leader Nursultan Nazarbayev. They agreed that after the signing those 3 would be fired, and others with them. The announcement was scheduled for August 20th. If you know you lose your job on Tuesday, what do you do on Monday? You might think the loose draft killed the union by giving everything away. That is the comfortable answer that blames words on paper. The harder answer is that the draft kept the union alive just enough to threaten the men who could still strangle it, and those men still had keys to Foros. The answer to that forest meeting is a name you have not heard until now: the New Union Treaty. 3 words that meant Gorbachev would stay president, but of a ghost. On August 18, 1991, at 4 p.m., state phones went dead at Gorbachev's dacha in Foros, Crimea, and the special communications line was cut. At about 4:54, men walked in without invitation, led by General Valentin Varenikov of the ground forces with KGB generals. They laid a paper on the table and demanded he declare a state of emergency or resign. Gorbachev refused and told them they were committing a crime, demanding to call Moscow and face the Supreme Soviet. They left him in the house with guards at the gate, no phones, and no television except state channels. His family stayed with him while the Black Sea hit the rocks outside. That night the conspirators formed the State Committee on the State of Emergency, the GKHP. 8 names made the list: Gennady Yanayev, vice president and now self-declared acting president; Valentin Pavlov, prime minister; Dmitry Yazov, minister of defense and marshal of the Soviet Union; Boris Pugo, interior minister with 350,000 interior troops; Vladimir Kryuchkov, KGB chairman; Oleg Baklanov, defense industry boss; Vasily Starodubtsev of the farmers, and Alexander Tizyakov of industry. 8 men who ran the men with guns. Early morning on August 19th, Moscow woke to music, not news, but ballet. State television played Swan Lake on a loop and every channel showed the same dancers. In a country where the news never stops, ballet means a coup. At 6 a.m., an announcer read Yanayev's decree that Gorbachev was ill and could not perform his duties. Yanayev assumed presidential powers and tanks rolled at 9 toward the White House, the Russian parliament on the Krasnoprenenskaya embankment. It was not the Kremlin they surrounded but Yeltsin's building. Yeltsin had slept at his dacha Arkhangelskoye too, and at dawn drove to Moscow, passing a column of tanks going the other way. He reached the White House before it was sealed and at about 12:30 p.m. climbed onto tank number 110. It belonged to the Taman Guards, the elite 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, its turret facing the crowd. Yeltsin read that the GKHP was illegal, that Gorbachev was still president, and that citizens must answer with civil disobedience and strikes. The crowd touched the steel and handed bread to 18-year-old conscripts who were told NATO had landed. In Leningrad, 300,000 filled Palace Square, and in Kyiv miners voted to strike. The plotters tried to arrest Yeltsin, but the KGB Alpha Group ordered to storm the White House at 3 a.m. hesitated. The commander said his men would not shoot the Parliament of Russia. At a press conference, Yanayev's hands shook on camera. A journalist asked if he understood this was a coup. The hands answered before the mouth did. Millions saw a committee that could not hold a glass steady, trying to hold a country. August 20th became a city of barricades. Buses were pulled across Sadovoye Ring, cranes lifted concrete blocks, and old women carried soup to boys on the parapets of the White House. The committee ordered the storm for 3 a.m., and 3 armored columns moved. At 12:30 after midnight near the tunnel on the Garden Ring, a column of BMPs tried to push through a crowd. The vehicles were blind at night. Dmitry Komar, 22, a former airborne soldier who drove a forklift, climbed onto BMP 536 to cover its viewport. The vehicle swerved and crushed him. Vladimir Yusov, 37, an economist with 2 children, ran to pull a friend clear and was shot as the hatch fired. Ilya Krichevsky, 28, an architect who loved theater, was hit by a ricochet and died by morning. 3 dead in a tunnel, the only dead in Moscow. Inside, the armor officers stopped because there were too many faces and too few orders. At 3 a.m., Defense Minister Yazov called his deputies and said troops must leave the center. By 5 a.m., tanks withdrew, and by noon the committee met in the Ministry of Defense and decided to fly to Foros to beg. Kryuchkov, Yazov and 2 others boarded a plane. Gorbachev refused to see them and flew back to Moscow on August 22nd, landing at Vnukovo. He thought the old job waited, but it did not. On live television that afternoon, Yeltsin made him read aloud the minutes of the Soviet cabinet, page after page, where ministers backed the committee. Gorbachev's face went grey on camera. He had returned as president of a country that had learned it could disobey him. 2 days later, he resigned as general secretary, banned his own party, and the building on Old Square was sealed as officers carried files out in boxes. You might think the coup killed the Union, that the 3 days broke it. That is the easy story of heroes on tanks and villains with shaking hands. It feels satisfying and it is half true. The coup did not kill the Union, it proved the center could not kill. Once that truth traveled by television to every republic capital, leaving became bureaucratic, not suicidal. The question stopped being can we leave and became how fast. The fastest answer was already scheduled 1,000 kilometers southwest, where one republic held a piece of paper that could make geography irreversible. That paper needed 92%, and it would get it. Ukraine held 52 million people, the second largest republic after Russia. It grew 1/3 of Soviet grain, forged 1/3 of Soviet steel, held the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, and burned the coal of Donetsk that heated Moscow flats. Without Ukraine, one of Gorbachev's own aides told him, the Union cannot exist as a real country. It would be geography without a middle. On August 24, 1991, 48 hours after the tanks left Moscow, Ukraine's parliament declared independence. Not sovereignty inside the Union, but independence from it. The word matters. Sovereignty meant higher status, independence means exit. A parliament vote is not a mandate, so Gorbachev insisted a referendum must decide, and Ukraine agreed. For 3 months the campaign filled every town. Even the Communist Party of Ukraine, which had ruled the republic, told its members to vote yes because Moscow could not be trusted after Foros. On December 1, 1991, the answer came. This is the vote you were kept from naming until now, the Ukrainian referendum. Turnout was 84.18%, with 31.9 million people voting from 37.9 million registered. The question was simple. Do you support the act of declaration of independence of Ukraine? Yes, got 92.26%, about 28.8 million votes, while no got 7.74%. Every single region voted yes. Donetsk, the Russian-speaking industrial heart, voted 83.90% yes, Luhansk 83.86%, Kharkiv 86.33%, Odessa 85.38%. Even Crimea, where the fleet lives and where Russians are the majority, voted 54.19% yes. That was not a western fringe, it was the east and south voting to leave their own capital. On the same day, Leonid Kravchuk, the former ideology secretary who once enforced censorship, won the presidency with 61.59%. He had spent his career climbing the party, and now carried a 92% shield. 2 days later he got a phone call. Boris Yeltsin invited him to meet in the Belavezha forest to talk about oil, gas and the Union. Kravchuk said he would come, but also that the Union was over because the referendum said so. No treaty can bring back a republic that just voted itself out with that margin. You think borders are lines on a map, they are also counts. 28.8 million is a count Moscow cannot argue with. December 8, 1991, at Vyskuly, a hunting lodge in Belavezha Forest, Belarus. Snow covered the pines and no journalists were invited. 3 men met around a wooden table. This is the sentence you waited for without hearing its name, the Belavezha Accords. The men were Boris Yeltsin for Russia, Leonid Kravchuk for Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich for Belarus, plus their prime ministers. Shushkevich chaired the Belarusian parliament and hosted because his forest had a secure government guest house with a direct line the KGB did not fully control. They came to discuss oil and gas debts. Yeltsin needed Ukrainian gas transit, Kravchuk needed Russian oil, and Shushkevich needed both. By evening they discussed something else. Kravchuk said after December 1 he could not sign any union treaty. Yeltsin said Russia would not finance a center without Ukraine. Shushkevich said Belarus would not be alone between them. 2 aides were told to draft a text. Gennady Berbelis for Russia and Vyacheslav Kevich's staff for Belarus typed on a Soviet-era typewriter. The key line was dictated in Russian. The USSR as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality has ceased to exist. They replaced it with a new name, the Commonwealth of Independent States, a voluntary club not a country, with no central president and no central parliament. Each republic would keep its army, its currency for now, and its borders. At about 2 a.m. on December 8 they signed. 3 signatures for 3 Slavic republics that founded the Union in 1922. Yeltsin signed first, Kravchuk second, Shushkevich third, with Prime Ministers Kebich, Fokin and Berbelis adding theirs. They phoned Gorbachev. Shushkevich called first and read the text. Gorbachev shouted that this was unconstitutional and that only the Congress of People's Deputies could dissolve the Union. He was right on law and irrelevant on power. Gorbachev called Yeltsin and heard the same argument. Then he made the only move a Soviet president had left. He called the head of the armed forces, Marshal Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, and asked if the army would defend the Union. Shaposhnikov said the army would obey the republics and would not arrest 3 presidents in a forest to save a map. Gorbachev could have ordered an Alpha Group helicopter that night to seize the lodge before dawn. He did not. He told aides he feared a civil war with nuclear weapons scattered across 4 republics. He was not wrong. There were about 27,000 warheads in total, about 11,000 strategic on long-range missiles, and more than 3,400 strategic warheads sitting outside Russia on Ukrainian, Kazakh and Belarusian soil. Who commands them if shooting starts? The lodge powered down its lights, and the forests kept the secret until morning news. Morning on December 9th broke the secret when Radio Moscow read the Belavezha text. World capitals called not the Kremlin, but Yeltsin and Kravchuk. Gorbachev protested the legality and legal scholars agreed that 3 of 15 cannot dissolve 15. But power had moved. The army issued a statement supporting the Commonwealth. The KGB was split and leaderless after August, and the West, especially the United States, signaled it would recognize the new states quickly if nuclear control was clear. Gorbachev was offered a last chance to negotiate a face-saving union. He tried and called the Central Asian leaders who had stayed loyal longest. He thought Kazakhstan and its president Nursultan Nazarbayev would back him. Nazarbayev listened and then flew to Alma-Ata. On December 21, 1991, 11 of the 12 remaining republics met there. The table was longer this time, with Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine and Uzbekistan, all except Georgia and the 3 Baltics already gone. They signed the Alma-Ata Protocol, confirming the USSR was dissolved and formally establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States on a wider footing. The Baltics considered themselves illegally annexed in 1940 and refused, while Georgia stayed out and would join in 1993. The documents also settled the 2 questions that kept American presidents awake: who controls the nuclear weapons and who sits in the Soviet seat at the United Nations. Russia would continue the USSR at the United Nations. For the weapons, promises were made on paper. All tactical nuclear warheads would return to Russia by mid-1992, and strategic warheads would follow by 1996. The leaders toasted while Gorbachev watched on television from Moscow. He now negotiated his own exit. Yeltsin visited him in the Kremlin to argue over the apartment, the pension, the archive and the dacha. Gorbachev wanted guarantees for his staff. Yeltsin wanted the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, without drama on camera. They agreed on December 25th. Gorbachev would speak at 7 p.m. and vacate the Kremlin by December 29th. His aides Yakovlev and Chernyayev helped draft 12 minutes. He would say the old system collapsed before a new one could work, thank his family, and not say the word surrender. December 25th, 1991, was Christmas in Washington and grey snow in Moscow. At 6:30 p.m., a crew from Central Television set lights on the 2nd floor of the Senate building. No crowd was invited, and Mikhail Gorbachev walked in alone. He was 60 and had led the Soviet Union for 6 years and 9 months. Last year he had received the Nobel Peace Prize. Tonight he ended the job because the job had no country. At 7 p.m. he spoke for about 12 minutes with the camera tight and his voice flat. He said, "Dear fellow countrymen, compatriots, due to the situation which has evolved as a result of the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." He defended perestroika and glasnost, said freedom had been achieved, and said the old system collapsed before a new one had time to start working. He thanked his wife Raisa, who had stood in Foros with him. At about 7:32 p.m., just after the speech ended, a sergeant on the roof got a phone order. No anthem was played and no salute was given. The red flag with hammer and sickle slid down the pole that had flown since 1922. It caught in the December wind and folded. At 7:45, the Russian tricolor went up the same halyard, white on top, blue in the middle, red at the bottom. Below on Manege Square, a few dozen people watched. Some cheered, some cried, and most stood in silence. A reporter asked an old woman what she felt. She said she would feel it when prices changed. Gorbachev walked out a side door, left the nuclear briefcase for Yeltsin in the reception room, and walked to a car as a private citizen. For the first time since he was a combine operator in Stavropol, he had no title. December 26, 1991. In the morning, the Council of Republics met in the Kremlin, and the hall was half empty. The lower house had already lost its quorum, because Russian deputies were recalled on December 12, so only the upper house could act. 70-odd deputies sat where 300 once sat. They voted that the Soviet Union no longer exists, and that they dissolve themselves. It was the last legal act of the state born in 1917, a body voting itself out of existence because the country it governed already had. By that day, 15 flags flew for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. 293 million people woke up in foreign countries without moving, and Kazakhstan, which declared last on December 16, had waited because its north is half Russian. Now the bills arrived. In Russia, output fell almost 40% by 1998, deeper than America's Great Depression, and male life expectancy fell from 64 to 58 in 5 years. In Tajikistan, a civil war killed about 100,000. The Baltics sprinted to Europe, and by 2004 were in NATO and the European Union. The warheads moved. In the first half of 1992, all tactical warheads, more than 15,000, were pulled back to Russia by train under armed guard. Strategic warheads took longer. Ukraine held about 1,300, Kazakhstan about 1,400, and Belarus held 81 intercontinental missiles at Lida. By 1996, under the Lisbon Protocol and the Budapest Memorandum, everyone was trucked to Russia, dismantled, and blended into low-enriched uranium to fuel power plants. A warhead that once targeted Omaha now lights Omaha. Today, every border drawn that December is contested somewhere. Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Chechnya, then Crimea and Donbass in 2014, and the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, all lie on lands that voted 92% to leave. The mechanism was not mystery. Printed money, a secret meeting heard by wiretaps, a ballet that signals a coup, a man on a tank who stops it, and a single sentence typed in a forest that says a reality has ceased to exist. Gorbachev refused to use force to keep his country because he feared what force would do with 27,000 nuclear weapons scattered across 4 new countries. He let paper win over the army. The next man who tries to rebuild what that flag covered will not have the same fear. He will have the same weapons, now consolidated in one place, and the same sentence, now waiting to be rewritten. What will he do with them?